to Michael Tomlan, who's going to give us a different perspective on preservation. And Michael, if you're ready, we look forward to that. And again, remember that after Michael, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we can continue. Thank you.
Michael, you're still muted, just FYI.
There I go. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. Well, welcome to everyone. I'm going to take a little bit of a different take in what it is that Anna has provided, looking at it from the point of view of the educational institutions that have become involved at the K through 12 level. I'm kind of the midpoint in the discussion of how it is that professionals assist, and basically the ideas change in the professions over time. I begin with John Dewey, whose School and Society was a bit revolutionary. Dewey believed that rather than having the students sit in classrooms and repeat lessons, they had to do things. That experiential education was the manner in which people were best educated. He had a dim view of academics who essentially would quote the classics. He was much more interested in becoming involved with contemporary society, and the School and Society Journal, which I show you, really begins to define what it is that contemporary education would be all about. Keep in mind that this is the time period for the rise of the AFL and CIO as a joint group. This is the rise of industrialization, the rise of actually the peak of Americans' agricultural prowess by virtue of the number of people that became involved. School and Society, and the 3 lectures that he began with in 1899 was linked to his idea in the chart that you see with kindergarten, primary school, high school, university, graduate schools, and the connection to grammar and normal schools, normal having to do with teaching, and more particularly technical schools and professional schools. You see, he's begun to parse out all of the pieces and parts. And of course, he was involved with the university's elementary school as well, right? Now, at the very same time as you see this rather applied means of educating students, that is by linking them to actual processes of whether it's weaving or spinning, whatever the case may be. We have the history of architecture by Professor Bannister Fletcher that comes out of the 1890s, but as I noted, is basically continuing to be influential throughout the 19th and the 20th century. What you find, of course, is the roots of the tree show that geography, geology, climate, religion, social and political and historical features are the things that you have to understand in the comparative method. And his comparative method had with it all of the illustrations that the British Empire had collected by virtue of the explorations in the previous couple of hundred years. He was interested as a lecturer, an extension lecturer, with museums and classes of all kinds in the entire range, including prehistoric architecture. and he produced the illustrative material that would be used in classrooms for decades ahead. The most important connection, and it relates to what it is that Anna said recently with respect to Burnham and the plans that the AIA was pushing along, is Wacker's manual on the plan of Chicago, which was a direct result of what it is that the plans in Chicago's late 19th and early 20th century are all about. And here you see 1,000 school board principals meeting with 8th grade teachers and officials of the Board of Education with the Chicago Plan Commission. So the linkage between the design elements and the historical elements were at this luncheon very well described, especially prepared, this particular text, prepared for the study in the schools of Chicago. The lessons in this textbook, in chapter 1, giving you a sense of how it is the history of the city developed from Fort Dearborn through its village structure in the 1830s, and then the gradual development of the city. You can see into industrial prowess is concluding in many respects for the basis of city planning that takes place. At the same time as there in the center of the screen, a series of questions are asked the students about what is important about the world's population occurring at this time, and more particularly, what resources are modern cities endeavoring to conserve? What are the city problems in saving? Now, interestingly enough, this has a tremendous effect in American education, although it's been generally outside the scope of preservation education up to this point. This is how the present came from the past by Margaret Wells. Wells was an educational reformer who did her PhD work in Newark, New Jersey, and promoted essentially more, and she quotes directly what we see in school society. She was an advocate of experiential understanding, written for the boys and girls of the present in the hope that this digging into the past may make them better planters of the future. And opposite that, she's thinking of how it is that archaeologists have begun to refashion in the result of restoration, believed to show how men looked who lived in these caves 50,000 years ago. Now, the questions, once again, in this particular text are very instructive. And you begin to get a sense of how the progressive city, going beyond the city beautiful to the progressive city of the early 20th century, begins to list modern inventions, which you see on the right-hand side, the plower and the sewing machine, the typewriter, the dynamo, the airplane, and begin to involve the students in planning a book into which they can put pictures and stories of inventions so they can understand the past and the present in various terms. There are in the 20s textbooks in the realm of educational guides that basically reiterate, as you can see, the very same text. This is a principle tracing the principles of post and lintel from prehistoric times. The children and architecture become involved in museums was no surprise by this point at all. More particularly, though, are the records of the notebooks that show the individual differences, the sketchbooks, where in fact the newspaper clippings or original materials and some photographs are combined in such a way as to allow the students to participate in projects which are meaningful to them. Now, at the very same time, of course, school architects, that is the subdivision of the profession that was beginning to deal more concertedly with school architecture, and this rises to the fore with the immigration patterns that you see throughout the country in the early 20th century. The principles and practices essentially have changed as architects begin to understand how it is the concerns of the classroom have broadened, because there are different kinds of classrooms, different kinds of specialties responding to the rise of commerce and the rise of industrialization going forward. So the commercial department and the science department are seen as essential elements of the centralized school. And remember, the centralized school system is developing first in Massachusetts in the 1890s, but increasingly throughout the United States. Going forward, then you see after the Second World War, we go through the Depression and we understand the effects of the Depression and the manner in which the Second World War diverts resources. There's this question of how it is that a city is going to rebuild itself, right? And here we find Building Atlanta's Future in 1948, a book that has grown out of Atlanta, an attempt to picture the spirit and shape of the city. And what do you know, I've marked in red there halfway down on the right-hand side. The idea for the book first came out of a talk between the practical businessman at Atlanta and Atlanta's lawyer and member of Board of Education and Wacker's Manuals work, right, which had been done in the, remember, the early part of the century. So the idea of improvement is part and parcel of this discussion that is in being inserted in school curricula. And that, of course, is a tremendous change in emphasis, because we begin to see the rise of urban renewal in academic institutions, K through 12 as well. Now, to put this in perspective, remember that the planning profession begins at Cornell University and Harvard University with the Carnegie Institute support, Carnegie's support in 1935. So the question of where the planners are at this point has to do in many respects with the federal programs that had been developed during the interwar period and became federal policy. But how did Atlanta become what it is today? Well, you cite the history of Atlanta from the Indian trails and highways and railroads and the railroad history as part of the time period. What you find then is, through the 40s and early 50s, a series of books that are similar, cast by urban renewal architects, engineers, and planners who become involved in defining urban problems and solutions. And this is the Boston example. There are other examples. Boston, of course, is interested in showing good teachers what it is they need to know to encourage motivating activities, causing students to become actively involved in solving problems. And here you see stimulating the boys and girls to make their own investigations of conditions that are seen in their own neighborhoods. The instructions are very clear. The examples are very clear. And this is a wonderful example where Boston essentially is throwing open to the broader historical place that it has in the post-war era, doing its best in this case to introduce the students to both European and American examples. And you'll notice that in essence, this is a precursor. If you think about it, in 1948, it's exactly the time that John Reps was beginning his career at Cornell University as the head of the Department of City and Regional Planning. Now, Philadelphia also plays a role, and it's a very important role, because it essentially had looked over its shoulder, so to speak, at what was going on in Chicago for some time in its leadership and planning. And of course, Boston and New York had also played a role. New York's exhibitions in the 30s had the Futurama as the future. Well, what you find, of course, is that the same thing occurred, but to a limited degree in Philadelphia, just a little bit after that. And you see the Philadelphia Housing Association here putting together a report that is basically dealing with all of the school activities, linking them to neighborhood improvement. Now, in point of fact, this was not particularly new. For those of you who are from Chicago, you know there is a linkage between the Chicago park system and the Chicago school system. The same thing was seen in educational circles in the school district in Philadelphia. But looking at reaching the neighborhoods and the then current, of course, television, radio, and publications media campaign relates to what it is that your redevelopment authority and how it could improve your neighborhoods. Now, the fact that this is part of the school curriculum and the discussion in the 1950s, it can be seen as the precursor for what it is that the preservation movement encounters. Elementary schools essentially are involved with social studies curricula, and these have various in grades 5 and 6 opportunities to have the students begin to understand. The biggest lack, of course, is the almost complete absence of good material related to the life of a city for the use of pupils in all of the lower grades. And earning a living in Philadelphia and examining the city neighborhoods, these things become part of how it is that children can be educated. Notice at the bottom of the screen on the left-hand side, the mention of San Francisco, because when you do the search of urban renewal literature, oftentimes you omit the understanding that was projected within the school system. Now, of course, what happens in 1957 is very near and dear to my own education, because when Sputnik was launched, the educational community, regardless of whether it was university or grade school level, was catalyzed in such a way as to understand, well, what is it that the Russian schoolboy does with his time as opposed to what the American schoolboy does? Sports became basically the whipping post, if you will, because there was far more interest in sports and far more proficiency in sports. But the crisis in education, as it was understood in Life magazine, was really projected in any number of ways into curricular reform. And it basically affected all grades and college as well. Now, contemporary understanding, of course, about the space race is colored by virtue of the fact that the Cold War disappeared during the Reagan administration. The Cold War in the time period, however, was a big issue, and the competition between America and the Soviet Union to lead in space exploration, of course, then focuses on science, math, technology, and engineering. Basically, all of the things that shifted were along those lines, but it was very practical in many respects, including agriculture, because the science in agriculture had to be ramped up rather considerably. Now, the National Defense Education Act put money into the process in such a way as the colleges of engineering in particular ramped up their understanding of communication. This is in the era pre-internet. This is the DARPA era, if you will, in the defense appropriation. But you understand that the Cold War had a linkage. There's also, for the university context, providing federal help to foreign language scholars, area study centers. These characteristics are often overlooked, where the fact that you didn't understand the relationship between the ramp up in defense spending and language study, which was necessary to understand other parts of the world. At the very same time as we were going through curriculum reform in K through 12 and college entry courses, and I well remember this, we had the Kennedy administration slipping into the Johnson administration, a magical shift in the endowment for the arts, as the arts became a way in which to unify populations that otherwise weren't given expression. And the interesting aspect of this over time, and I'll come back to it, is how effective it was with very little money by comparison to other things that were taking place. And of course, what I'm showing you on the right-hand side is the decrease in federal funding and the decrease in the manner in which these projects have become obvious. It's most obvious in the 1990s, when most of the state matching monies that were made available in the endowments, both in the humanities and the arts, shifted to private money and rather pulled back. The states followed the federal in pulling back in appropriation. But this becomes important because the Architects in Schools program was jointly sponsored by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Education Program and Arts and Environmental Arts Program, and participating state arts agencies. And I point out to the fun in this particular slide that the kids are creating a castle with a little blue moat and a drawbridge based on the plan that is shown on the right. The idea that experiences of creating historical objects of one sort or another, local linkages being made, becomes more obvious in the 60s. The part that I particularly enjoyed, of course, is working with kids in bubbles, inflatables, which were so popular in the 1960s and 1970s, and more particularly, the experience, the mystery of the turnpike, so that the activities both inside the classroom and outside the classroom are more, in a sense, experiential ever before. Now, in my office is a slide deck, which reminds me all of this, the National Slideshow, Architects in Schools, slide decks with basically the booklets and tapes that would be used to teach teachers and to also teach students and get them involved. These things became more commonplace as the NEA supported them, and the state NEAs and NEHs supported them. But these are my heroes in a sense. Nancy Hanks is the person in the center. She was chairman of the board until the late 70s for the National Endowment for the Arts. And Bill Lacey on the left-hand side, Bill was an architect, and Caudell Rowland Scott from Texas, who became the dean at the University of Tennessee. He was the one who admitted me to the University of Tennessee. I have a favorite linkage to Bill and his history. And of course, what you see on the right, for those of you who can't distinguish what it was leased by the GSA to Trump most recently, but it's essentially was the center for the Nancy Hanks Center for the National Endowment for years. It was known as the Hanks Center. Now, when you move to the 1970s, fast forward, you see we're coming out of the 60s. We're already into the middle of the Vietnam War. We're into this question of what it is that the riots and the disturbances with the country are all about in the 60s and early 70s. But at the very same time, in the midst of this, is another piece of environmental legislation, and probably the most important one, because it begins to bring together all of the clean air, clean water, historic preservation, all of the things that had taken place in the early 60s, and that is the Environmental Education Act. Now, the reason that becomes important is because environmental education then becomes established at the federal level, and going forward is in the 70s, first and foremost, among the things that the bicentennial embraced. You all understand the role of the books by Macaulay in animating historical activities and how things get built and how they get put together. But you begin to see how all of this is related to, at the very same time, why Roots hits home as we shift gears from the melting pot to the American mosaic paradigm for social organization, again, during the bicentennial. What you then find, of course, is the National Trust taking on a bit of a leadership role in 1973 through 75. They're establishing a preservation education wing. And it was Dick Haupt and Antoinette Lee, that is Tony Lee, a Virginia native who went into the National Trust after having completed her PhD at George Washington University, that led the charge for preservation education inside the National Trust. I kept this information, I still have all of the notebook materials that were generated, but more particularly this shows you on the lower right-hand corner the built environment education team that Stu Stein, one of the senior professors here, mounted in 1975, dealing with the questions of how students would become involved in the activities of the mayor and the city council and the class making presentations in Elmira. They also began to work with people in Corning and in Post in the latter part of the 77, 78, and 79. The Corning Foundation stepped up to the plate, and to make the connection for you, the Corning Foundation, of course, was behind the restoration of the Market Street Restoration Agency, which was the model for the National Trust Main Street program. So it gives you some sense of how involvement in preservation issues is tied to the funding and the development in kindergarten through 12th grade. This is yet another textbook of major import for the 1970s and to a degree the 1980s. which again is environmentally based, but incorporating preservation issues. Why does a place affect us? How do we create the place? Now, as it turns out, there's a considerable amount of linkage once again to the National Endowment for the Arts that made possible the publication of this book. This is a Texas-based text that again testifies to the environmental education activities that are taking place. You can begin to see how all of the administrators from the universities became involved as well. Now, what you find then in the late 70s and early 80s is a tremendous amount of discussion that takes place with spatial history, creating personal space, the school programs that began to involve the whole range of personal space and public space and territory and personal needs and neighborhood contexts advances rather considerably. And it's that gives us the assessing of the environmental education which takes place. The 1980s and 1990s were the place where the Heritage Education Initiative, the first Heritage Education Initiative of the National Council for Preservation Education came about, with Emma Adler, Antoinette Downing, Kenita Hankins, and Kathy Hatch with Barbara Timken. Kathy and Barbara, all of these women have had at the time a hand in calling out the need for a redoubling of the efforts on heritage education. And that essentially leads us to the next steps into the internet age. And I will cede the platform at this point to my colleague, Lena, I guess after the break, right?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I should have been taking closer notes. I'm going to have to watch this again, but it is available to us. I kept trying to do kind of the family tree of preservation education because there has been a constant ebb and flow, it looks like, for much longer than I had thought and have been involved in my career. So at this point, if we have any compelling questions, otherwise we'll take our break for 10 minutes, and actually we'll take it for all of 12. Let's go until 1:15, the presentation time. So whatever time it is, 15 minutes past whatever hour you have, and we will rejoin you for the next presentation, and then hopefully a lively and open discussion. Thank you.